The forest he entered looked dark and frightening. It seemed that the red eyes of countless horrible monsters were watching his every move. The screams of various creatures filled the forest, making it even more scary. Simon was not so sure if he should go on or if he should go back to the dormitory while he could. But still, his confidence won out over his fear, and he thought that since he had permission to go out that night, it would be a waste of a chance if he turned back. He cautiously walked on, nervously looking around and constantly swallowing the lump that was coming up his throat. As he walked along the path, he noticed a sign on the side that warned him to beware of monsters in the forest. Simon thought that there were monsters in Les Hill as well, but he didn't know what kinds of monsters lived here on Roke Island. He knew he had to be careful. He walked on in his mind, checking the route from the map. There was a stream to the east and the outer walls of Keyzen to the west. He was definitely on the right track. A howl from the woods startled Simon, and nervous sweat broke out on his face. He decided to check out who was making it and went deeper into the forest, hiding behind the bushes, wondering if it could be some big animal. A moment later he saw red eyes watching him closely from the bushes, waiting for the right moment to attack. A second later, a huge werewolf jumped out of the bushes at Simon. It moved so fast it was like a flash, trying to kill its prey instantly, but our hero was ready, though scared. He quickly pulled out his big knife and clattered off the werewolf's claw attack. He didn't know what kind of monster it was too fast to get a good look at in the dark. But after stepping back a bit, he had a moment to look at his opponent. It was a werewolf, a giant humanoid wolf whose goal was to kill anything that moved. Simon went on to think that judging by its size, it hadn't fully grown yet, but still, if he had met it before he came to Keyzen, he would have just run away from it. But now, even after a few days of training, he had something to show for it, and he cast a spell after which skeletons of ratmans appeared from the ground, which were gathering themselves together with the sound of bones. Then he pulled two swords out of his subspace with a roar, and they flew upward. And his skeletons grabbed and squeezed these swords with their bony paws. And now he no longer had to run away with such power, because his two ratmans were now standing in front of him with swords in their hands. In response, the furious werewolf only growled. And with a dash, he rushed at Simon and his summons. Simon ordered his skeletons to get ready. And when the werewolf almost reached them, Simon sent his skeletons to attack, and they fearlessly jumped on the enemy and made several cuts. But this was not enough to stop the werewolf, and with one blow he threw one of the skeletons away and smashed it to pieces. Simon felt the blow as if he had been hit, and his eyes blurred, and he screamed in pain. But this did not stop his summon, which continued to attack the werewolf, stabbing and cutting him from all sides. Simon noticed that the enemy was already quite wounded and exhausted, so he shouted, "Now!" He cast a restoration spell, and now again the two ratmans flew in a leap to finish off the werewolf. They took turns one by one stabbing their swords into the monster's back. And they continued to hold it like that. Then Simon ordered them to stab the monster again from the other side. One of the skeletons was able to nail the werewolf with his sword and crush it directly to the ground. And Simon, as if in some anime opening, made an epic leap and ran to finish off the werewolf who was already on the ground. He tried to get up but couldn't. Simon accelerated and jumped to plunge his short sword into the creature's head. He did so in a moment, and the werewolf's blood splashed the ground. He sat down on the ground next to the defeated enemy and exhaled with relief. It was close. Simon noticed that this was his first battle in Keyzen, and thanks to the fact that he practiced putting together the ratman skeleton, he was able to win this battle. A few weeks ago, if he had met such a monster in Les Hill, he would have run away as fast as he could. But now he could defeat a werewolf after only 3 days of training in Keyzen. How strong he could become if he could last 3 years at Keyzen. But then he came to his senses and realized that he didn't have time to delay. He had to clean up the place before the other monsters started to gather here at the smell of blood. There was also another problem. The skeleton that had been hit by the werewolf was now completely out of shape and was falling apart. And in a minute it was completely broken, and Simon was very upset about it. When Simon took a closer look, he noticed that the skull of the ratman was too badly damaged, and he praised his fallen skeleton as he said goodbye. He turned to the remaining skeleton and told it that they should be careful. because they would not be able to win the next battle like this, and it nodded in response. Together they walked on, pushing aside bushes and small trees that rustled in their path, when eventually Simon said they were there. But when they got to the clearing, it was completely empty, not even grass was growing. Suddenly Simon had a thought: since nothing grew here, it could mean that there is something underground, so he took a shovel and a flashlight from subspace and was ready to dig. He gladly took the shovel in his hands and swept the ground, wishing he had borrowed the shovel before he left the dorm. His rat man held the flashlight for him. With a clatter, they began to shovel the not-so-soft ground on the lawn. After some time of work, they were able to dig a large hole before they came across something. It was some kind of black stone platform with a round hole in the middle, and Simon assumed it was some kind of device. He cleared it better with his hands from the ground and dust to take a closer look. The hole was just big enough to fit his fist. Then he reasoned that since it was some kind of Necromancer's device, it must be able to react to darkness, so he put his fist to it and began to fill it with his own darkness. After a moment, a blue flash passed through the device and Simon noted that it seemed to react. With a hum, a passageway with stairs leading down opened up in front of Simon, who was mesmerized. He was surprised as to how there could be a staircase and where it could lead. He stood looking into the darkness ahead and did not dare to go there. But in a moment he had a smile on his face. He was very happy that he had such a cool adventure that night. So he told his skeleton that they would go downstairs and see what was there. Downstairs, a dark large room was waiting for the guests, which looked like some kind of ancient temple or sanctuary, with many obelisks and 2 doors on either side of the largest obelisk, which was entangled with roots. All the walls were painted with ancient runic words, and at the base of the largest obelisk was a human skull. Everything was covered in dust and it seemed that no one had been here for decades. The skull looked quite creepy. Simon and his companion began to descend and Simon was excited to see what this place was. He had a hunch that it was some kind of ancient ruins or something similar. Walking further, he noticed something and tried to reach it with his hand. It looked like ancient runic words and he ran his hand along the wall. He wondered what it was for, but he had an idea that so many ancient runic words all over the building must have been there for a reason and served a purpose. Perhaps this building was some kind of giant magical device. Simon finally reached the main hall and was now looking at the obelisks. Suddenly, his skeleton started knocking its bones to get his attention. Simon asked it what was wrong and if it had found something. The skeleton led him to a skull with a hand-shaped notch in front of it, and Simon wondered what the skull was for. He touched it and felt as if someone had stung him, although the surface of the skull was smooth. Simon was surprised. Even with his little knowledge of the undead, he could tell for sure that this undead thing was extremely old and terribly dangerous. Looking at it he wondered what such a disgusting thing was doing here. Suddenly, with a thud, a whole pile of human bones fell to the floor from somewhere from the top and scared Simon. But when he realized that it was just bones, he went over to take a closer look. They scared him quite a bit, but the question remained: what was it? He picked up one of the bones, turned it around and realized that it was the number 2 bone, which is needed to bring the skull back to life. Although he had never worked with human bones before, he began to attach bone number 2 to the skull. He wasn't at all sure how this undead thing would react when it woke up. It might even try to harm him, but he wanted to try to put this skeleton back together anyway, his curiosity overcoming his fear. He placed the skull on a stone pedestal and decided that now was the time to boldly try something new. Simon gathered the darkness in his hand and prepared to begin. And in a moment, he put his hand to the notch, which shone with a blue glow at his touch. The flames of its darkness grew around the skull, reaching the ceiling of the hall. For some time the skull showed no signs of life. But eventually its eyes glowed with flames and Simon shouted joyfully, "It worked!" He was very happy because he had managed to wake up the skeleton and now the only thing left to do was put it together from the pile of bones on the floor. Simon began to assemble the skeleton, bone by bone against the wall, and as it turned out it was not quite easy, but he was gradually getting better at it thanks to the fact that he had been focusing on studying summonology for the last few days. If he hadn't done that he would not have been able to put the skeleton together even overnight. He wasn't 100% sure he had it right, but it was a human structure, so he knew enough to be able to put it together without any missing parts. Fatigue was gradually showing on his face. But what surprised him the most about this skeleton was its size. It was incredibly tall. If only he had known this at the beginning, he would have definitely attached everything else first, and the arms, and lastly the legs. As he was finishing assembling it, he noticed that this skeleton looked really cool when all the parts were in place, and it was definitely taller than 2 meters. When he finished assembling it, he wondered what he should do now, but a moment later a small star shone over the skeleton. With a blue flash, the skeleton came back to life and began to laugh ominously. The walls of the building began to move, and the skeleton continued to laugh eerily. Simon did not understand what was happening. Everything around him was shaking. The floor of the building also began to move and began to lift him up. There were flashes of blue light around him and rune words everywhere. The runes were concentrating around the skeleton and spinning around, and he began to exclaim, "Finally! Finally, I'm back!" The ground shook with his words. His eyes burned with a dark flame. In flashes of blue light, his kittens were covered in darkness, and he screamed, "Who dared to disturb him?" Simon could barely stand on his feet, such was the power coming from that skeleton. Finally, the skeleton looked at Simon and said to him, "You there, human? Was it you who woke me up? Name yourself." The frightened Simon introduced himself as Simon Valencia, and the skeleton seemed surprised by this answer and asked if he was really Valencia. Then he shouted that he could see that he was indeed a descendant of Richard. Simon covered his ears to avoid going deaf and shouted back that a descendant sounded a bit far away, but yes. His father's name is Richard and he is his son. Finally the skeleton said he now understood. That's why he felt that his darkness was like his father, because only Richard could have awakened him. Simon was not sure if he agreed. Then he gathered his courage and asked who he really was. The skeleton began to pull out his sword, which was tangled in the roots of the trees. The skeleton introduced himself as Fayer, the master of the battalion, then slung his giant sword over his shoulder and added that he had once ruled the entire continent with his father, Richard. Simon was very surprised by this news. How could this creepy skeleton be the undead of his father? Then the skeleton asked him who brought him here, and Simon replied that it was Nephthys Archbold who told him about this place. This did not surprise Fayer at all, and he added that it was just like her. When Fayer had learned all he wanted to know, he said, "Well, good," and stuck his sword in the floor. He began his speech by offering Simon Valencia a contract to lead the battalion. Simon asked again, "A contract?" Fayer explained to him that the battalion would be his will and would crush everyone and everything that stood in his way, and all things in the world would bow down at his feet and beg for mercy. However, there was one thing, and Fayer warned him. That Simon would then be obliged to go down the road of bloody destruction, and this would become part of his destiny. After all the promises and warnings, Fayer asked him again, "Is he ready to lead the battalion?" But Simon was in no hurry to answer and wanted to ask him something else. He said he didn't know what Fayer would be useful for or what type of undead he was, and this was the first time he had heard of the battalion. And then he asked if the battalion he was telling him about was really that powerful. Fayer looked at him and told him that the fact that he dared to ask about the battalion's strength without any doubt or fear says a lot about him. It was a great question, one that he did not expect to hear from a human being. So he will answer it. His battalion is very strong, strong enough to destroy Kizen right here and now. However, his father in the past, the former leader of the battalion, freed all of them at once and sealed him up here, and now thanks to Simon he is free again and awake. And now their battalion has taken its first breath of life again thanks to him. If he can gather all the scattered forces of the battalion and restore its strength from the past, no one on this continent will be able to stop him. Simon thought about this tempting offer. And he agreed to it, saying that he would sign the contract. Fayer told him that this was a great choice and grabbed him by the collar, pulling him toward him. He put Simon on a pedestal in front of him. And he opened his chest in front of him with a blue core in the middle, then told Simon to put his hand on the core. For the last time he warned him that once the contract was concluded his life would change completely, and he now had one last opportunity to back out if he was scared. But Simon told him that there was nothing to be afraid of if Thayer and his brothers were really his father's army. And it was the only right thing for him to do to accept it. Thayer hummed in approval, accepted, and thought that although this guy seemed polite at first glance, he had the qualities of a supreme ruler inside. He grinned and told him loudly that he liked his spirit and Richard had raised him well. Thayer then proclaimed that he would commence the contract, and a bright blue flame blinded Simon. Finally, engulfed in flames, he shouted, "Don't die, Simon Valencia." Simon was shocked by the news and only managed to ask what. Shrouded in darkness, he began to ask Thayer to wait a moment and explain what he meant. When he told him not to die, but it was too late, the darkness was pulling him in. He began to lose consciousness. In a moment he was lying motionless on the pedestal, and Thayer only managed to say, "Oops." Then he asked the rat man if he thought the master was dead, to which he vigorously began to deny, shaking his head. Suddenly Simon came to and shouted, "What?" He stood up under the astonished gaze of Thayer, who already thought he was dead. Simon had a bunch of questions that he was not afraid to ask. What happened? What about the contract? To which Thayer simply told him that the contract had been successfully concluded. And he should feel some changes inside. It was true, and Simon put his hand on his chest to get a better feel of how he was. He felt that his core was not the same as before. Thayer asked him how it felt, if it was bigger and more stable. Simon said yes. Before, the darkness overwhelmed his body even if it stayed in it for a while, but now he felt so comfortable, as if he were in warm water. Thayer then congratulated him on becoming one of the 7 battalion commanders, to which Simon responded with an uncertain thank you. He tried to get to his feet, but immediately lost his balance. Thayer warned him not to overexert himself as his body had gone through a transformation. Simon grabbed his head and said that his head hurt a lot and he would probably have to stay here for the night and rest. Thayer laughed and added that it would bother him for a while. Simon also had what he thought was a side question he wanted to ask Thayer, which he didn't mind. But it turned out that he was not at all prepared for such a question. Simon asked him what a battalion was. Thayer's jaw dropped from this. When he recovered, he began to yell at Simon, how he dared to sign a contract with him without even knowing what a battalion was. But Simon began to justify himself, saying that he had told him he didn't know. He hit his forehead in disbelief, exhaled and said, "Unbelievable, it seems it will take him a while to understand what kind of person Simon is." But he eventually agreed to explain, but having been burned once before, he asked one more question to find out how uneducated this man was. So he asked him how much he knew about the undead. Simon replied that he knew as much as a freshman at Key's End without any preparation for it. Thayer laughed at this answer and said that it was funny that a freshman dared to come here and that it was quite like Richard's son. And he agreed to explain it to him at his level, for which Simon was very grateful. Thayer began his explanation that the undead in this world can be divided into 3 groups: summoned undead, natural undead, and the battalion. First of all undead that necromancers like him control are summoned undead. They are artificially created from black magic and move at the summoner's command. They disappear if the effect of black magic weakens or after a certain period of time. The natural undead are formed without the involvement of necromancers or black magic. Usually when people think of the undead, they imagine this type of undead because of their blind hatred against living creatures and extreme aggression, and people also classify them as monsters. This statement was quite clear to Simon. Thayer continued that the last but not least category of the undead is the battalion and pounded his chest, pointing to himself. He characterized himself as a middle ground between the summoned and the natural undead. The battalion is similar to the natural undead in that it can exist independently with its own core, but like the summoned undead, it obeys the orders of necromancers and higher-level undead. There are only 7 battalions in the world, and if you look at it another way, there are only 7 necromancers who can control the battalions. And then he pointed directly at Simon, telling him that he is now one of those 7 necromancers. Thayer continued that generally a summoning necromancer would lead an undead the size of a platoon. As their summoning skills improved, The size of their undead armies also increased, but there is no direct proportionality. He had once seen it as big as a squadron, but in general they are not that big. Simon wondered what about the necromancers who had graduated from Kizen. He was sure that many of them must have been highly skilled masters. Feo confirmed his assumption that those high-level necromancers can operate an army of the undead the size of a corps, but he often finds them inefficient. Simon doubted his words and asked why he thought so. Feo reminded him that he had just told him that all undead led by a necromancer are considered the summoned type and the summoned undead move based on the darkness of the summoner. Simon couldn't help but agree. Continuing his story, Feo explained to him that both summoning and controlling the undead consume darkness and mental strength, so it's obvious that it burdens them when the size grows large. Simon stroked his skeleton, gradually understanding how necromancer magic worked. He remembered that when one of his skeletons was destroyed on the way here, he felt a severe headache, and now he knew why. The reason was similar to what Feo had told him before. The summoned undead and the necromancer are connected, and a lot of damage burdens the summoner. This is where the huge advantage of the battalion over the summoned undead comes in, as the undead from the battalion move through their own independent power, and that is why there are no limits to the size of the battalion. This allows you to control an infinite number of undead. It can be thousands or millions. Feo then asked, "Have you heard of a story of a necromancer leading a gigantic army of the undead?" Simon replied that he had. Feo assured him that all these stories were about battalion commanders. Simon looked at his hands and couldn't believe that he had become one of the 7 necromancers whose summoning quantity is limitless. Feo finally asked him if he had answered all his questions, and Simon clenched his fist and said that he had, and he was very grateful to him. Then Feo, pretending to be reasoning, said that now that they had successfully concluded the contract and were now in the same boat, like it or not, should they talk about plans for the future? Simon didn't have anything against it, so they started the discussion. Feo said that they are both under special circumstances because Simon is a student at Kizen. And then he asked if he was going to leave his studies there. Simon replied that, at the moment, no, because it would be against his father's will and he still has a lot to learn there. Feo did not agree very happily, that Kizen has some value that Simon can leverage. Seeing his companion's mood, Simon asked what special circumstances he was in. Feo corrected him, clarifying that he was referring to the special circumstances of his battalion and himself. Simon asked if it was the fact that his battalion had been dissolved that made Feo feel a little uncomfortable. He replied that it was, but that there was something more necessary than that. Simon asked what that was. He explained to him that his battalion is currently a public enemy of the necromancers and that it was easier to explain it to him. They're a wanted group. Simon was shocked by this news. Feo began to explain why, because of a crime committed by the former battalion commander, his father Richard. Simon was very excited by this news and could not fully believe that his father was a wanted criminal, but then he remembered what his father had told him when he left him at the entrance to the Kingdom of Dresden and did not explain why. He asked Feo if it could be related to this crime. He replied that it was most likely the same reason. Then Simon asked what kind of horrible crime it was. Feo took his time answering and looked at him. He began by saying that it was a crime that could not be forgiven in the world of black magic and that his battalion had also aided and abetted the crime. That crime was treachery. Simon looked at him, still not understanding. Feo continued the story. Richard fell in love with a priest, while the centuries-old war between necromancers and priests was still going on and the entire continent was engulfed in the flames of this struggle. And even at the most sensitive times, Richard made an order to the battalion to protect his lover no matter what. Even when other necromancers came to kill her, his battalion had to kill many of them, and it was only natural that they gave the order for his battalion to be exterminated. And this order is probably still in effect even after his battalion was disbanded, which is why he cannot openly appear in the public eye. Then Simon had a logical question: does Feo resent his father? The latter asked in indignation if he was. Such a weak emotion did not exist in the battalion, and he punched the floor to confirm. Of course, if his son did something like that, it would make him very angry, and he began to glare at Simon in earnest. But despite everything he said that Simon should not feel guilty about it, it was all the will of his father and his ex-commander. But then he corrected himself a bit, it was the will of that monumental jerk. Simon asked again, a jerk. And Fayre told him that he was not going to hide it and would tell him everything about him. That bastard was the lowest of scum, the worst. He made girls cry every day, annoyed professors, and skipping class was the least of his deeds. Simon felt a sense of déjà vu with what Nephthys was telling him. Fayre shook his head at those memories and said he could see that the scumbag now had a son. But then he realized something and said, wait, his son, why didn't he think of that before? And he was horrified to ask if he was really Richard's son, and did that mean? Simon smiled, and with the sweetest smile he could muster, said that Fayre had guessed correctly and that his mother's name was Valentia. This news caused a piece of Fayre's skull to fall off. He jumped away from Simon in horror, screaming, "What did you just say?" Clutching his head, Fayre couldn't believe that he had made a contract with the son of his friend and enemy. Looking at the guy who was clearly up to something, smiling, he couldn't believe how it was possible. Making facial expressions like his mother, Simon said, "Honey, dinner's ready." Such a blow irreparably damaged even the battalion head, who upon imagining this grabbed his head and shouted desperately, "Or do you want to take a bath first?" Not wanting to stop there with the same expression, said Simon. However, for the commander of the strongest battalion that used to rule the continent, this was the last straw. Unable to bear it any longer, he shouted at the guy, telling him to stop already, as he would now be haunted by terrible dreams. Rolling on the floor, the battalion commander tried to forget what he had just imagined, while Simon, sitting on the ground, laughed loudly. Then with a happy smile on his face he said he couldn't wait to work with Fayre, to which he called him a scoundrel and told him not to smile like that woman. Fayre finally calmed down and came to his senses and sat staring at the floor with a sigh, then said in a resigned voice that since nothing could be changed, he should return to their conversation. Simon agreed. Pointing his finger at the boy, the battalion commander said that from now on he should choose a profile in Kizan and get stronger, besides he should not tell anyone that he owns the battalion. When Simon asked why this was so, he replied that he was not just an outsider, but the son of Richard himself. So the elders might be angry with him because of their blood connection, but that wasn't the only reason. Poking the stupid boy in the forehead with his finger, he asked what he thought about what would happen if the other necromancers found out that a novice student at Kizan owned a battalion. Hearing this, Simon asked Fayre if he meant that the necromancers who were stronger than him would come after him. To which he replied that he did. Then he asked Fayre what he should do in that case. Simon already knew the answer to that question, and it was to become stronger. After praising Simon for the right answer, Fayre told him that now he should learn everything he could in Kizan, and then the battalion would gradually regain its former strength. Simon, having heard such sound advice, replied that he would do so. Then the battalion leader said that now they had to find a way to lead the battalion, despite the special circumstances in which they found themselves. Then calling Ratatouille over to him, he said he had a couple of ideas. He then pointed to the skeleton mouse behind him, where it immediately went to stand on two paws. Simon was a little surprised by the actions of his summoned creature. As he continued to stare at the mouse, he asked Fayre if he too could control his summoned creatures. He replied dismissively that of course he could, adding that they now shared the same darkness, so the skeleton summoned by his darkness would belong to the battalion. However, even though he could command them, Simon was still in charge, while he was second in power. Then looking at the mouse, he informed that this undead had never registered for the battalion. Simon asked in bewilderment what that meant. Grabbing poor Ratatouille by the head, which made his eyes burn even more intensely, Fayre told him to watch carefully. The next moment, streams of darkness rushed into the mouse's head. They enveloped him in a ball of darkness. Simon, who was watching, was stunned, not realizing what was happening. After the ball of darkness disappeared, the remnants of the mouse burst out of the holes. And he started to fall to the ground, unconscious. As soon as he landed on the ground, hitting the floor with his bones, the battalion commander introduced him as an already registered undead. Simon looked at the mouse, who looked around in bewilderment, and not finding any differences, Simon told Faye that he didn't see much difference. The next moment, however, the eyes of the already registered Ratatouille lit up with a darkness that was stronger than before. The battalion commander explained that in simple terms, it was the process of turning the conscripted undead into natural undead. Hearing this, Simon asked if the skeleton now had its own core. The skeleton nodded affirmatively. Simon realized what had happened to his skeleton and said that if he brought it to school, he would be caught immediately. Simon replied that he didn't have to register all the undead, adding that if the undead hadn't existed for a long time, like him, it would be better to use the summoned ones in battle or to gain knowledge. And if any of his undead expire or are seriously injured, he can always bring them to him. He would register them into the battalion and leave them here, and if the damage was not fatal he could always heal them. Hearing this, Simon was delighted with Faye's plan. After the battalion commander finished explaining the plan, he said that he would only need to become stronger, because if he could summon the flawless undead species, the battalion's strength would increase significantly. The enthusiastic Simon pounded his fists with Faye and replied that he would do his best. However, noticing something, he turned to the battalion commander, informing him that his skeleton, who had passed the registration, was acting more like an animal. He explained that it was because it had adopted some of the characteristics of the natural undead. However, that didn't change the fact that the power still remained with the owner, which was the guy, so he would come at any time if he called him. Then turning to Simon, Faye asked how long he had been studying at Kizen. He replied that it had been 3 days. Hearing the guy's answer, he said that in a few days the first-year students will be able to get their first assignments, and then he will be able to travel all over the island of Roke and the entire continent using teleport. Hearing such great news, Simon's face lit up with happiness. Faye continued, saying that as soon as the time comes he will go with him, as this way he will have the opportunity to manage the battalion and gather forces that were scattered across the continent. Surprised by the battalion commander's knowledge, Simon asked him how he knew so much. He replied irritably that it was because he had been with his father throughout his time in Kizen, and he was also responsible for the management of his battalion. Then, taking his hand to his chin and leaning toward the boy, he asked if he wanted to know about it. Simon, with his eyes burning with excitement, enthusiastically replied that he wanted to know. Then he asked with interest why the summoned undead sometimes disobey the Necromancer. Faye drew a diagram on the ground and explained that it was because the interrupter lacked understanding of the summoned undead. That was why it was impossible to judge the undead with little knowledge of them. Then he added that the undead were driven by a strong belief in the underworld. Not quite understanding what the battalion commander said, Simon asked what he meant. He replied that in simple terms, the most similar concept was willpower. To give an example, it could be compared to the fact that if you hate someone very much and dream several times a day to kill that person, the undead that will be near him will memorize his will. And so if the undead internalized his will, it would kill that person while he wasn't around. And it didn't matter whether he thought so now or had forgotten about that man, his undead would still remember his will to hate forever. Hearing the battalion commander's words, Simon had a hard time believing it. Seeing the boy's concern, Faye told him not to worry as he would warn him about such things. Besides, this information would help him understand the world from the undead's perspective. Looking at his natural undead once more, Simon thanked Faye sincerely for such useful information. The battalion commander decided that while we were on the subject, it was time to teach him how to order the undead to attack. Rising to his feet, he told him that the first thing he needed to do was to strengthen his will, regardless of the target. As an example, he told Simon to imagine that the wall behind him was his enemy, adding that he should try to hate that wall more than anything else in the world. Hearing this, Simon concentrated and replied that he agreed. Faye began to say words that were not the most pleasant, but that would make him angry, telling him that he had to take revenge on that wall for his parents, and that the wall had killed his favorite person. Then he added in a loud voice that he should tear, throw, and also destroy his enemy. Suddenly it was as if a switch had been flicked in Ratatouille, and his mouth opened in anger. Then he rushed at full speed and crashed into the wall, driven by the battalion commander's words that he should kill him, creating a massive explosion in the process. He then furiously continued to strike the wall while Fayer continued to motivate him by shouting curses towards the wall. And as a result, the mouse's hatred for the wall became really big. Watching all of this, Simon turned to Fayer and said that it was all a bit too much, to which the latter replied that he had added harsh words to make him understand better, but what was much more important was not what he was saying, but what he was actually feeling. Since high-class necromancers must be able to fake their will even in not the most important situations, as well as plausibly think rage, hatred, and the desire to kill, as these negative emotions were the most powerful and effective. Finished with his explanations, he suggested Simon to stop the skeleton by taking control of it. He replied with an uncertain face that he would try. Simon shouted to Ratatouille to stop, but despite his words he did not stop. Fayer was waiting for Simon, who tried to stop his skeleton without losing hope. But despite all his attempts, he did not pay any attention to him, continuing to furiously attack the wall. This situation made the guy furious, and he gritted his teeth in annoyance. Then he let out a furious shout that made the whole room change color for a moment, ordering him to stop immediately. Then turning to the mouse that had finally stopped attacking the wall and turned to him, he told him coldly and with fury in his voice that if he disobeyed him again, he would not let it go. Watching the angry Simon with interest and surprise, Fayer noted that he had just been able to use an absolute order. Then looking at the guy with a slightly frightened look, he wondered what kind of monster Richard had created. Simon asked frustratedly as he calmed down and came to his senses, "I failed, didn't I?" Looking at Ratatouille, who had all of his bones broken and one arm missing, he sadly added that he couldn't even control his own undead. However, his sad words were interrupted by Fayer, who informed him that he had done well. However, he emphasized that in this area, one could not lag behind and stop at what he had achieved, but had to constantly practice so that the undead would obey him from the first order. Hearing the battalion commander's encouraging words, Simon replied in a tired voice that he would do so. Suddenly Fayer supported Simon, who had almost fallen to the ground, and told him that his condition was caused by stress and the shock of what he had seen. Simon sat down on the floor and sighed heavily, saying that he would take a break and return to Kizen, since he only had permission to be outside for 24 hours. Hearing this, Fayer threw something to Simon, adding that he should take it then. Catching what the guy threw to him, he asked what it was. He replied that since they would need to communicate with each other in the future, he could use this badge, which was his alternate personality, and with the help of which he could communicate with him at any time, and if he got into trouble, he could not worry and just call him for help. Looking at the thing Fayer had given, Simon thanked him. Then leaving, he added that he would be back in a week. The battalion commander replied that he would be looking forward to his new achievements. Hanging on Simon's uniform and watching everything through his badge, Fayer laughed and said that it had been a long time since he had been in Kizen. Talking to the guy, he asked if the protection period was still in effect, and without waiting for an answer he added that he was eager to see what would happen next. Simon asked with a blank stare what exactly he wanted to see. He hesitated, not knowing what to say. Then, noticing the tension of the guy who was sweating and holding a pen with a trembling hand and even trying to write something, he asked him if the test he was writing was difficult. "Let's go back a day to last night." Sitting in his glasses with a smart look on his face, Dick announced that they were starting to prepare, while Simon folded his hands in front of him, saying he was listening intently. Pointing with his pen to the class schedule, Dick announced that both of their classes, which were to be in the afternoon and morning, were elementary black magic classes. However, the most important point was that this class included the infamous group work. And once assigned, the group remains unchanged until the very end of the semester, which is why this was going to be a crucial moment that could decide the fate of their survival in Kizen. First of all, each group consists of 4 people, so it would be best if each member was good at something specific. Like how he's average in all subjects, but a little better in the dynamics of darkness, while Simon liked summonology the best. So even between the two of them there was a good balance. Then Dick began to explain everything in more detail, starting with the fact that they had 9 different subjects. The first was catarology, then dynamics of darkness, summonology, hematology, toxicology, magic combat, as well as defense against holiness and elemental black magic. Among all these subjects, the largest percentage of all third-year students were involved in catharology, dynamics of darkness, and summonology, and that was why these three subjects were called the three sciences of necromancers. And since Simon's specialty was summoning and his own was the dynamics of darkness, Dick said they had to find someone who was good at catharology. When Simon asked him what they should do with the remaining space, Dick listed the remaining options, and immediately put aside holiness defense and black magic, since they were mandatory items for everyone. Next was magic combat, where students often had excellent grades only in this subject, as they were fully dedicated to it, which was not suitable for their team. On the contrary, experts in catharology were well versed in defense against holiness, making them perfectly aware of their enemy. Similarly, hematology had many similarities to toxicology, which was why students often studied both subjects at once. Shocked by his friend's knowledge, Simon asked if they really needed to know all this, and Simon replied that they did. When he had finished with the theory and picked up one of the sheets on which the students' names were written, he said with a satisfied look on his face that they needed the guys from that list to join the team. The strategy was to get the first student on the list, but if they failed, they had to move on to the second. In addition, Dick reminded Simon, who was listening attentively, that he should also remember to emphasize his special pass to demonstrate maximum superiority. To which he held up a sheet of paper and replied that he understood. Then stretching their hands to the top they exclaimed with joyful voices that victory was in their pocket. However, reality was cruel. Sitting in front of the test he couldn't solve and holding his hand over his head, Simon looked depressed as he recalled their confidence in victory yesterday, realizing that it wasn't as easy as it seemed. A nearby Dick whispered quietly to him, asking what the woman was doing in the freshman class. Simon didn't know what he was talking about. He replied by pointing to a woman standing in the middle of the class, saying that her name was Jane Olivia, and that she was the vice-chancellor of Kizan, and that she was also known as a walking terror who could expel even a third year. His words, however, did not go unnoticed, for the next moment she called his name, which made him rather startled. Turning to Dick she said in a cold voice that life was full of contingencies, adding that if he continued to talk she would consider it cheating and cancel the result of his examination. Hearing this, Dick quietly apologized. However, Dick was not the only one who felt uncomfortable in the presence of Vice-Chancellor Jane. Addressing the students she said that many students besides Mr. Hayward were also wondering what she was doing here. She then added that they already knew that she was only teaching third-year students, so many may have thought her presence here was temporary, but this semester she would officially be the head of Class 1A. Adding that she hoped they wouldn't disappoint her with too much difference in skills. She then said that they should concentrate on the exam now, to which there were unsure responses from the room that they would. Sitting at his desk and holding a quill in his hand as he drew something incomprehensible on the test sheet, Simon pondered the fact that he didn't know any of the answers. He had finally come to grips with reality and realized that even if something good had happened, and even if he had his father's battalion of foulness under his command, it didn't mean he could easily pass the test, much less stay in Kizan. Even so, he didn't plan on giving up. He turned over the paper and with a firm conviction on his face, he decided that he would try until the very end. After finishing the test, all the students began to leave for a break, as they would have one more class after that. Sitting in front of a stack of students' tests and picking up a pencil, Vice-Chancellor Jane announced that she would begin grading. The assistant sitting next to her also started checking the tests while someone's baby blue-haired head appeared beside them, trying to look at the test sheets with a satisfied smile on her face. Approaching Vice-Chancellor Jane exuding a warm atmosphere. This little girl, who turned out to be Nephthys, lifted up on her toes and looked at Vice-Chancellor Jane, who immediately asked what she was doing here. She answered cheerfully that she had just come for a walk. However, the Vice-Chancellor, who did not share her emotions, just looked at her without emotion. Then she tapped poor Nephthys on the head and told her not to distract her. Then, not paying attention to the girl who was clutching her bruised spot with tears in her eyes, she ordered the others to finish grading in the empty lecture hall, to which the aides immediately nodded affirmatively. After the aides left, Nephthys angrily yelled at Vice-Chancellor Jane that when she picked her up she had been such a kind and innocent girl, unlike what she was now. To which she replied casually that the innocent girl had become that way after working and stressing all day and night. Then with a sigh she turned to the girl, saying that if she had already come, why not help her check a few tests. Looking at the next test, Vice-Chancellor Jane's eyes widened in surprise. After all, the student to whom the test belonged could not solve a single basic question, but managed to solve the most difficult last problem. Seeing the stickers on the names that did not allow them to be seen, Nephthys asked Vice-Chancellor Jane why she had done it. She replied that it was a blind assessment, as the names could influence the examiners. Hearing that, Nephthys said it sounded pretty cruel for the first test of the semester, adding that it was scary. However, she was not going to give in, saying that although it was a simple test, it showed a lot of interesting things, like the paper she was drawing on, pointing to it and saying that the person had answered the second question about ingredients in toxicology correctly, but was wrong on the next one, which was in reverse order. Hearing this, Nephthys irritably snatched up the test sheet and said that was what she was talking about, adding that the kid was so stupid she was even curious who he was. Taking another test, Vice-Chancellor Jane began to analyze the test and noted that it was the exact opposite of the previous one. Although the student had failed most of the most basic questions, he had managed to solve the most difficult one. However, the formulas he used for the calculations were almost everywhere wrong. This information surprised Nephthys quite a bit. The Vice-Chancellor said that judging by the formulas used, this student had not prepared well for the lessons, but simply combined superficial knowledge based on the lessons of the last week. Looking over the test, Nephthys also noted that he had used a formula from summonology in a problem to calculate the amount of darkness, simply assuming that in darkness, resistance is proportional to loss. This was a rather interesting statement, and the girl asked with interest what the answer was. To which Vice-Chancellor Jane replied that if one uses Theron's theorem one can arrive at an answer of about 1,200,000. However, to the student's surprise he wrote the value of 1,200,146 and although it was not the answer to the question, he was able to calculate using a completely different formula almost correctly. Turning to Nephthys, the Vice-Chancellor said she had something she wanted to ask. She peeled off a strip of paper with the student's name on it and asked her why she had assigned her to the first-year students. Then picking up the test sheet that was Simon's, she added that they weren't just freshmen. It was the class that the boy was in. Nephthys smiled without answering. Then showing her tongue and laughing she said she didn't know what she was talking about. Realizing that he was the one she couldn't get anywhere. The Vice-Chancellor went back to checking her tests and noted irritably that even at 300 years old, she was acting like a child. Standing at the grading board the students were divided into two groups, those who were happy with their grades and others who did not pass the tests well. Dick and Simon were surprised at how quickly the results were posted. There were more and more students near the results, which only increased the amount of noise. Under Simon's full name were the results for all the subjects. Simon sighed heavily when he saw them, saying that although he thought he had done well, it was not so. Dick reassured him, however, and said that despite this he had managed to get a high score in summonology, which was quite impressive, considering that he had never studied or prepared anywhere before. Then he gave Simon a friendly pat on the shoulder and reminded him that, as he'd said yesterday, it was best to have a clear profile and focus on one thing rather than everything. Simon asked Dick, in a dull voice, how he was doing and if everything was all right. He replied that the highest score was 74 for the subject of dynamics of darkness, while the rest varied from 60 to 70 points, so the average was about 70. Simon looked at Dick with a shocked expression on his face when he heard this, noting that he had excelled at everything. But he replied that these were not very good results, and it was just enough to avoid expulsion. He turned his gaze to the grading sheet and said that there was a little problem with their plan now, then answered Simon's question, who asked what he meant by saying that all the students' grades were posted in the first class of the day. However, their plan would have only worked if this information had been made public before they had set up the teams. But now the test scores are available to everyone. Which meant that if they were unlucky, they wouldn't be able to find even one person. However, the noise near the results was interrupted by someone's voice that asked everyone to listen to her. It was none other than Vice-Chancellor Jane, who crossed her arms over her chest in an emotionless voice and told the students that they had 30 minutes to check their points and unite in teams of 4, adding to the confused students who did not expect such a rapid development of events that if there were no unforeseen circumstances, their group would remain like this for the rest of the semester. After that he also informed that from now on elementary magic would be a group subject. Moreover, the tasks that would be given to them could be done only in groups. Also, each student will have 2 separate grades for individual and group work. However, no matter how good a student is at individual work, their grade will not be honored unless they can show teamwork. Having finished with the theory, Vice-Chancellor Jane advised to choose partners wisely. As soon as she finished, chaos broke out. Excited shouts of students could be heard everywhere, either looking for students who were at the top of the list, or those who were just shouting their demands about how many and with what level they needed in the group, or just offering their candidacy by communicating their strengths. Simon stood in the middle of the chaos with a piece of paper, looking at Dick's list and remembering his words that he would talk to Jamie, who was number 1 on the list, while he should talk to number 2, which was Claudia. However, looking in her direction he saw that she had already formed a group with the other players. Looking at the next ones on the list and glancing at them, Simon noticed to his disappointment that the 3rd and 4th option on their list had both managed to merge into one group. Realizing that worrying about it wouldn't do any good, he decided to calm down, telling himself that there was still time, since no one had gathered a group of 4 people yet, since everyone was scrambling because of the time limit. Moving among the crowd looking for possible participants, Simon thought about the fact that what they needed most right now was a catalog. Besides, most of the students who had banded together in groups of 3 or more had average grades, while the best students were still observing. Which meant they still had a chance. So deciding that now was as good a time as any, Simon walked over to Malin, who was sitting alone at her desk, not giving any indication that she was going anywhere. However, Simon didn't care, as this was their chance to create a strong group. So turning to the girl, he said with a serious expression on his face, "Malin Willen, join our group." His words made the jaws of the guys in the background drop open. However, they weren't the only ones who were surprised. The other students also stared in surprise, wondering how he had the guts to just walk up and say such a thing to the best student in the class whose grade point average was above 90. However, there was no plot development where she just walked up and joined in. In response, the girl called Simon ridiculous and asked him contemptuously if he thought she would just join them. Then she said that she only trusted the people she chose, while he invited her despite the fact that he had a grade point average of only 30. He just nodded in agreement. Malin continued to talk despite the noise of the students who were discussing Simon's behavior, saying that she saw that he was pretty good in summonology, but that this was his only high score. Then adding that her grade was still higher than his. To which the man replied in a calm voice that he knew, after which he asked her to promise her something. Then he asked the girl to give him a month, saying that after its completion he would surpass her in summonology, and if suddenly he could not, he promised to leave Kizen. The girl heard his words and stared at him with a shocked look, unable to believe what she had just heard. When she came to her senses, she immediately shouted at him that he must be crazy, then told him to leave if he didn't want to make a fool of himself. However, Simon calmly replied that he wouldn't do that, adding that he was just propositioning her. After hearing his words and calming down a bit, she sat back down, and then there was a pause between them. Reflecting to herself, she realized that this semester she had to keep first place no matter what. Her main problem was Hector. Even though she was able to surpass him in the written exams, there would be difficulties in the combat tasks. And to beat him, she had to excel in group classes. Which meant she would have to fill in the gap in summonology, which was the only subject she wasn't as good at. Looking again at Simon, who was the student with the first special pass, and the man who had beaten Hector without a prep course, she wondered if he was a chance for her to stay in first place. To look for another student with a higher score in summonology or to bet everything on him, that was the question. Standing up from her seat and turning to Simon, Malin reminded him of his promise, asking him if he was sure he was ready to keep it. To which he replied in a firm voice that he was. Then holding out his hand and smiling, he added that he would keep it no matter what. She looked at his outstretched hand and thought for a moment. Malin shook his hand and replied that she would join them. As soon as they were through with the formalities, a joyous Dick ran into Simon, almost knocking him to the ground, calling him a miracle, and began to ask excitedly how he had managed to persuade Malin. The girl didn't understand what was going on and asked who he was. Simon smilingly replied that he was also in their group and reminded her that he had told her that he was inviting her to join the group. Hearing this, Malin was dejected as she realized who she had joined the group. She called Dick a freeloader and said she would never forgive him if he got in the way. And that was the beginning of a legendary team,